I'm John Arnold. I'm the Executive Director of the Board of Regents, and I get to be the moderator for this round. So welcome to the quarterfinals of the Oxford debate portion of the Regents Cup. Congratulations to our 4 contestants for getting through the early rounds this morning and making it to the quarterfinals, where now it gets real. This afternoon, we will engage in an Oxford-style debate. I know you all know this, but I am required to repeat the following sentences. There will be 3 rounds in this debate. The first round, you will hear opening statements presented by 1 student from each team, the affirmative team, and then the negative team. Each team will have 7 minutes. I will give you a warning sign after 6 minutes, something along the lines of this. I know I'm very small on your screen, so I apologize, but it beats me yelling at you. In the second round, teams will engage in cross-examination. This is an opportunity for dialogue among the teams, and we'd expect you to ask questions of each other during that round. That round will last approximately 30 minutes. In the final round, 1 member of each team will present a closing statement. Again, we'll start with the proponent. The closing statements will be 5 minutes, and I will give you a warning after 4. Before we get started, the prompt for this round is, quote, "There are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum." Before we start, let me introduce our distinguished panel of judges. Judges, thank you so much for sticking with us through this afternoon. We really appreciate your time and your expertise. Joining us is Sean Beinberg, an assistant professor at the Arizona State University School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. Gretchen Conger is the Deputy Chief of Staff in the Governor's Office. Welcome, Gretchen. Tammy McLeod, the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Flynn Foundation. Always good to see you, Tammy. Mark Miller, the Dean and Ralph W. Bilby Professor of Law at the University of Arizona's James E. Rogers College of Law. And finally, Lisa Nelson, the Chief Executive Officer of the American Legislative Exchange Council. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Again, that prompt is, there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in curriculum. If the proponent team is ready to go, you may begin.
I would like to thank our opponents and grateful judges for taking the time out of their Saturday to have a debate on productive discourse and free speech. That said, Ben and I affirm that there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from the library or use in a curriculum. Since text is a form of speech, we provide the definition of offensive language offered by the Supreme Court in Shablinski versus New Hampshire as the lewd and obscene, the profane, the libelous, and the insulting or fighting words, those which by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. The Supreme Court decided in Hazelwood School District versus Kohlmeyer that educators may limit both the style and content of curricular materials if their action is reasonably related to legitimate pedagogical concerns. Thus, it is the burden of the negative to prove that banned texts have better value compared to alternative texts. In framing this resolution, it is important to discuss the affirmative burden. We in the affirmative do not have to advocate that all or even a sizable portion of offensive texts be banned, nor must the affirmative grant administrations sweeping powers to determine which texts are banned. Only that there are offensive texts, currently prohibited or not, that should be banned from the library or use in curriculum. We offer the following arguments for texts that should be excluded from the educational environment, being contention 1, texts that dehumanize a particular group. As Christian Rospol argues in the European Journal of Political Theory, some forms of disrespectful expression might be conversation stoppers because they aim at others as targets rather than potential conversation partners. These forms of speech lead to fear, flight or fight, rather than any learning process. Thus, public expression should be constrained by the ideal of not discouraging or disabling others from participating in public deliberation as equals. Additionally, texts that target some students substantially impair their ability to learn, thus denying them equal access to education. As Allison Myra explains in the North Dakota Law Review, hate messages and their stigmatization cause long-term psychological harm because they draw upon and intensify the effects of stigmatization, labeling, and disrespectful treatment that the victim has previously undergone, causing victims to forgo opportunities, to avoid certain places, and to engage in self-censorship of speech. The traditional remedy of more speech within the marketplace of ideas is unlikely to alleviate the hurt or to provide relief. Richard Delgado further extrapolates in the California Law Review that dehumanizing messages increase the likelihood of further stigmatization and even violence against one in the future. Psychological evidence suggests that permitting one person to say or do hurtful things to another increases the chance that he or she will do so again in the future. Moreover, others may believe it is permissible to follow suit. At Yale University, Stanley Milgram showed that many members of a university community could be made to violate their conscience if an authority figure invited them to do so and ensured them this was permissible and safe. The evidence suggests that allowing persons to stigmatize or revel others makes them more aggressive. Dehumanizing texts prevent marginalized students from participating in campus discourse or receiving equal access to education. Our second contention is that texts that are categorized as inciting language. As defined by the Supreme Court in Brandenburg v. Ohio, inciting language is language where the speaker intends to incite or produce imminent lawless action, and the speaker's words or conduct are likely to produce such action. Such speech has no place on a university campus. A myriad of studies have shown that fear and stress substantially harm students' abilities to learn. Professor Ted Grace, writing in the Journal of American College Health, explains that the cognitive load associated with excessive stress results in empirically lower academic performance and higher rates of attrition among college students. Furthermore, according to Professor Teresa Damouche in the Journal of College Student Development, substantial stressors negatively impact students' general health and quality of life long after their initial impact has dissipated. Do not let students be targeted and be the victim of violence. The negative allows for an environment in which texts that advocate for violence exist. Contention 3, instructional materials on repugnant acts. Texts that instruct students on how to perform repugnant acts have no place in a productive educational environment. Examples of these texts would include information about how to maximize casualties in a school shooting or bomb-making manuals. There's a clear, bright line between these materials and acceptable educational material. Specifically, we look to the Fourth Circuit decision in Rice versus Paladin Enterprise, which held that a publishing company was not afforded protections under the First Amendment for the publication of a manual for assassinations and would be held liable for a death in which the victim's killer allegedly relied on the manual. The court specified that speech was not protected by the First Amendment when it was the very vehicle of crime itself. A Department of Justice report explains persons who attempt or plan acts of terrorism often possess literature that describes the construction of explosive devices and other weapons of mass destruction. The intent of these manuals is to serve as a vehicle of knowledge that creates violence. They were created for instructing the components to the never-ending story of destruction. The negative allows for that story to not have a conclusion in our educational system. The university has an obligation to promote productive discourse and educate its students. These three categories of texts we provide to you are antithetical to that purpose, and therefore have every right to be regulated because of them targeting specific groups, trying to instill violence, and create a negative learning environment for students to learn from. And for these strong reasons, Ben and I are proud to stand in the affirmation of this debate.
All right, thank you very much. The negative team, you may begin.
All right, first, we would like to take this opportunity to thank our excellent opponents for this quarterfinal round, as well as our judges and moderator. Free speech is precious. Let us celebrate it. Abigail and I negate the resolve that there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. The explicit burden called for by the resolution is simply, are there certain texts that should be banned? The negative burden, thus, is to prove that banning is not a justified action in schools. As an observation, Carla Shedd, a professor of sociology studies at Columbia University, explains that research has overwhelmingly concluded that a child's social environment shapes their long-term attitudes and behavior. Shedd cautions that we must be exceedingly careful of what behavior we allow in schools, as it may create a lifelong complacency to it. If we are able to continue to protect our First Amendment, we would do well to keep in mind these words of Noam Chomsky. If we don't believe in the freedom of expression for people we despise, we don't believe in it at all. Thus, Abigail and I stand in strong negation of a resolution that allows books to be banned in schools. Allowing censorship at even the most simple level creates a complacency with it that threatens freedom of speech as we know it. Our first contention is that context matters. As advocates for free speech in schools, Abigail and I do not believe in completely banning books from circulation. However, a complete and total ban would actually be less damaging than what the affirmative is proposing today. See, the pro side is calling for a ban of books from curricula. This means that the books are still not only in circulation, but likely in public and even the school's libraries. This half ban is not only a threat to free speech, but children's safety, as frequently challenged author John Green explained. Text is meaningless without context. What usually happens is a parent chooses one page of the novel to send to an administrator, and then the book gets banned without anyone who objects to it having read more than that one particular page. When we decide that the content of a book is severe enough to prevent it from being taught in curricula, but it still belongs in public and school libraries, the pro side is taking away the context that classrooms would provide, but leaving the book within the student's reach. Texts that promote dangerous political ideologies like fascism should not be banned. They should be taught, and taught with the full context of the issues with them. Removing context but leaving books is a recipe for disaster. Additionally, classrooms are crucial sites for learning different perspectives. Educators are best equipped to decide what is beneficial material for students to read. Educators have a unique combination of training and experience that allows them to navigate what content is best for children and how to navigate these difficult topics. Teachers are generally experts in selecting age-appropriate content, but let us do a thought experiment. What if one bad apple chooses a book that is not age-appropriate? Should the administration immediately ban the book to protect the children? Abigail and I absolutely recognize that there are books that are not age-appropriate for certain children. However, there are far better solutions than banning these books. After conducting a meta-analysis of instances of book banning in the United States, Megan Palmer explains for Southern New Hampshire University that there are plenty of ways to prevent children from being exposed to inappropriate content that celebrate free speech. One example is empowering students to hold their own mock trial in which they get to debate whether a book should be in their curriculum. For more intense subjects, administrators can set guidelines that do not explicitly ban books, but further caution against specific subject areas. This furthers the classroom discourse that can happen, as students are not led to believe a specific subject does not exist. Instead of banning a subject, teachers can instead explain to children why it is not appropriate for their class, but also the necessity of learning it later in life. There are a couple key issues that the pro side references in today's debate that we will briefly respond to. We agree that much of the violence they describe should be prevented, but banning books is not the way to do so. First, they claim that we should limit content that does not have pedagogical value. However, recognize that the greatest education does not come from strong literature. It comes from strong debates around it. Books like To Kill the Mockingbird are powerful not only because of the text on their pages, but because of the debates that occur in the classrooms as students are reading them. These debates become silenced as soon as we remove divergent opinions, which means we decrease the pedagogical value of all books when we ban some. Second, they reference incitement. In the court cases they cite, Brandenburg defines incitement as something that poses imminent harm. In order for the speech to be inciting, it has to immediately prompt action. This is physically impossible with literature, as readers do not get the books as they are being written, but months or years or decades or centuries later. Third, repugnant acts. We again argue counterspeech is essential, as the Center for Partisanship and Ideology concludes that extreme political ideologies are best combated when they are surrounded by counter voices. If we remove these books, they will get pushed into the microchasms on the internet and echo chambers, which will further radicalize these ideas. Instead of learning why school shootings are bad, people will learn how to commit them in the shadows. We must surround these books with education and context that are so important in our learning. Banning books is censorship that threatens free speech and children's development. If we affirm today that banning books is ever okay, we are affirming the future generation of children being raised to believe that censorship is appropriate. Not only are bans incredibly damaging, but they are unnecessary. Thus, in the pursuit of a society in which all individuals are raised with a confidence in their own freedom of expression, as well as an ability to respond to difficult subjects without censorship, Abigail and I are incredibly proud to negate.
All right, thank you. We'll now move into the second phase of the debate. It's about a 30-minute discussion around these items. What I'd like to do is give each team the opportunity to assess the strengths and weaknesses of their opponent's arguments and opening statements. And then I'll ask you to ask questions of the opposing team. So we'll start with the proponents. Proponents, please give us a review of the negative team's arguments and statements, pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses. Thank you.
I think that the negative team has a good point when they say that we need to have robust discussion about topics that are offensive, right? The question is how we go about having this discussion, and that's where this debate comes in, that we disagree with their absolutist position that you need to have complete freedom of expression in order to have a reasonable discussion. We think that this absolutist position actually undermines reasonable discussion because of the examples that we've laid out. And I'll just use the first one. When you have a text that is not engaging in good faith discussion, but is instead attempting to undermine its opponents by dehumanizing them and excluding their voices from the discussion, that text can't be the cornerstone of a reasoned debate. That text must be looked at in a secondary manner and cannot be directly assigned, and in fact is harmful to be directly assigned because it inhibits the abilities of some students to participate by dehumanizing them off the bat.
Thank you. Negative team, any thoughts on the proponent's arguments, strengths and weaknesses? I know you addressed some in your opening statement, but please.
Yeah, we absolutely agree. And I think that the pro side makes a really great point, which is that when we start conversations with the assumption that one side is inferior, that is not free speech. Those are conversations in which one side is coming in at a disadvantage, and that side likely will not have the opportunity to be heard. However, this is why we believe that classrooms are essential, because books like To Kill a Mockingbird that visibly dehumanize specifically Black people in America have the power to change how we view race in America. When they're taught in a proper context, educators who have experience dealing with children and complex issues and combining the two understand how to make works like that not dehumanize either side, but empower both. And we believe that dehumanization is something that should be avoided. But the only way that we can combat this is by having open public forum conversations in classrooms with administrators, with parents, with children's. And we believe that the other side is taking the absolutist position because they are saying that if a book has something that is dehumanizing or disagreeable, it should be banned. And we simply refuse to allow books to be banned.
I want to clarify our position in the resolution. The resolution says that there are certain texts with offensive language that should be banned. Our opponents are trying to paint us into a corner where we have to say that any text that is offensive should be banned. That's not our position. We are just saying that universities or schools reserve the right to look at an educational environment, look at a book that they are putting into that educational environment, and if that text inherently dehumanizes prima facie students in the classroom and just assumes them as lesser, or the other categories that we put forward, that there should be a discussion about whether or not it should be banned, and they should have a decision about whether it can be banned. Our opponents are saying that we shouldn't have that conversation, that it should just be assumed that free speech is going to solve all the problems here, and students will just advocate their way out of dehumanization.
We do actually advocate for conversation. We just like to have it in a slightly different context. When you put a book in the position of should this be banned, it doesn't necessarily spur public discourse, right? It spurs one side believing that something is going to result and one side getting defensive around that result. We believe, as we articulate in our case, that there are a lot of ways to have these conversations. We aren't saying that all speech is wonderful and should be celebrated at all times. We agree that free speech has consequences, but the way that we deal with those consequences is through further free speech. We propose a couple of solutions. One of those would be using mock trials, which our author from New Hampshire University found to be really effective. It engages students with the material because students get to put the book on trial, and in their own way, they get to discuss these issues, they get to discuss censorship, and a common result in these mock trials is that students decided not to read the book, but it's not in the context of banning, it's making that choice for themselves. It is their freedom of expression, their freedom to choose. They are given the option and they turn it down because, we need to put faith in America's children and America's educators to be capable of making these decisions and capable of having these difficult conversations. And those conversations can only occur when we don't have a threat of banning.
Thank you. Did you want to respond to that directly, or do you have a question for the other team?
Sorry, Finn. Okay, thank you. I had a question for the other team because I understand your point that you're trying to make on instituting discourse, but my question is, these ideas that you talk about with books and stuff like that, can't these just be expressed through alternative texts? Why is it that we need that specific text that focuses on dehumanization, like targeting specific groups? Can't these same ideas be expressed through alternative texts that summarize the key points on both sides?
Well, I think part of it is because there's this problem because, first of all, we are giving teachers some discretion over what is being taught in the classroom, right? This does not just have to do with literature or literature that might be objectionable. This also has to do with a lot of different subjects, right? Like history. We teach about the Second World War and we teach about how these dehumanization processes take place, but we don't pretend like it's okay. We don't pretend that dehumanization is okay in a classroom environment. To say that just reading these books that are just manifestos on dehumanization and students will just absorb them and just start dehumanizing others, I think does not really reflect what happens at a school level and what happens at a pedagogical level. And teachers are trained to pick out certain texts that are appropriate for the students. I don't think that they would pick something that is so overtly terrible and just dehumanizing. And you also talk about how some of them incite violence or instructional materials for mass destruction. I don't think that there is a single case of a teacher who would assign something like that to students.
And if they do, it's likely in the context of, here is something violent, but here's why we don't do it, right? And that's the sort of claim that we're making, is when these conversations about dehumanization and violence occur, it is never because the educator is trying to say, hey, I just wanted to educate you all about free speech and how to build a bomb. Right? The conversations that occur are, here is Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber manifesto, and here is why so many people believed in these radical ideologies, and here is the counter speech that we need in order to fight against these radical ideologies and dangerous, violent propositions.
I think that the point that teachers won't bring it up is actually a point for the affirmative here, that you acknowledge that these texts that are providing information for repugnant acts or inciting violence have no place in the educational environment. We believe they continue not to have a place and therefore should be banned. There should be oversight of the teachers, just in case an instance like this does happen, that it's not allowed in the classroom. I think we can both agree that it's not allowed in the classroom. I also think that our opponents are forgetting about power dynamics in this situation. While the teacher may have the best intentions in, say, presenting a book that dehumanizes and attempting to respond to it or have students engage with it, fundamentally, the students are at a power disadvantage compared to the teacher. And the teacher gets the final say about what's in the curriculum in the negatives world. And we believe that there needs to be a check on that so that texts are presented in context. So we want to have a discussion. We don't want to have a text assigned that is engaging in bad faith. And that is what a dehumanizing text do. Say a scientific racist text that comes in and says that African Americans are inherently less intelligent and lays out pseudoscientific reasons. It's not trying to engage in productive discourse. Instead, what should occur is the text should be presented in a secondary text that puts it in context already, so we don't have to deal with the issue of students reading something that is not engaging in good faith. We can still have these productive discussions without having to engage with texts that are specifically not engaging in good faith with their students.
Okay, yeah, and there are a couple things here. I definitely am sympathetic to this argument about, you know, both sides agree. There are certain things that probably shouldn't be read, right? Langston and I, when we were researching the affirmative side of this topic, we came across some sexual education textbooks that made us start to think maybe some books should be banned. But the sort of issue that we encounter is that it's not quite as simple as, well, these books aren't going to be read anyway, so what's the consequence of banning them? Because one of the very first things that we introduce at the top of our speech is actually a sociology study published by Carla Shedd for the University of Columbia, in which she finds that when students are taught that their school is able to censor a book because of its content, they actually generate a complacency during their developmental years to censorship that is really, really difficult to challenge later on. And so, you know, I think I speak for both of us, especially with the books we came across, that argument is very compelling, but we really strongly believe that in the instance of these books that both sides agree are not educational and just deleterious to the learning environment, those need to be managed in other ways. Because as soon as we introduce banning, as soon as we introduce censorship, there's no going back. There is a complacency with that. And one more thing, and then I'll pass it over to Langston, is that, you know, this claim you make about books being able to be read in alternate contexts, that isn't what the resolution is asking. The resolution is asking if there are texts that should be banned, right? Banning a text does not mean you can put a different cover on it or you can put it in a section of another book. And especially, we would articulate that, you know, if you take something like Mein Kampf, for example, right? Obviously, we should not be having children read fascism, Nazism, but if you only select portions of that book and put it in another book, students will have a curiosity. They'll wonder, you know, what's being said on the parts that aren't excerpts. We believe in full access to detrimental materials because of the fact that counter speech works. And when you show children a book and say, you don't have to be afraid of this because this book is violent, but this book is wrong, you can educate away that violence and you can cultivate a community of care and a community that is sensitive and wise in the literature that they choose and the ideologies they follow, not one that lives in fear and complacency. And Langston, did you have something?
Yeah, I would also like to add on to that because the study that we show, I personally can see it in my life. I grew up in a place that was under almost 40 years of martial law. Like, you know, if something was said that was anti-government or anti-anything that the government believed, it was struck from the school curriculum. And to this day, there are still, even though where I grew up now is a very democratic society, we still struggle with that. And we're still having these debates about whether books should be banned because they believe that it is something that should be appropriate and should be allowed. So this is something that I think is very, very dangerous for a free and democratic society that so cherishes our freedom of speech.
So, judges, I think one important thing that this debate is starting to boil down to is a lot on like context and perspective on these texts, right? Finn and I provide with you the solution to all of this, that you don't have any confusion, you don't have any of this like horrible text spreading through, because you can still convey these same things through alternative texts. Like these banned texts, for example, like there's a reason why they're banned. It's because they target specific people. If you're going to have a teacher, right, that gives a text that dehumanizes you as a student, how are you going to feel in the classroom? You're likely going to engage in self-censorship. Why? Because the very power figure in the room that is supposed to be teaching you this, well, they may not have your best interest in mind. They want to dehumanize you. We're preventing this from even being a possibility because you guys talk a lot about context. Well, context relies on that specific teacher. We're here in the affirmative saying that there are certain texts that you guys even acknowledge yourself that are way too bad for the educational system. Why give it the possibility to do more harm if it's in the hands of the wrong person?
I want to follow on by saying that I want to address this speech solves argument that our opponents are making, and that counter speech is the solution. And I'll look to Alice and Myra when she explains that students who are targeted in this way and face this dehumanization, they face serious empirical psychological harm, and they avoid class. They engage in self-censorship. And she even goes as far as to say that having and allowing or saying that they're the ones who need to speak back and somehow respond to this dehumanization is not the proper way forward, because you are denying someone's humanity and then asking them to defend their own humanity. I'm all for defending ideas, but in classrooms, it's not acceptable to have an ad hominem argument, to attack someone directly and then force them to defend themselves. That's bad faith discourse, and that's the kind of discourse that we want to discourage by forcing these offensive texts to be presented in a secondary text context. Our opponents say that we're just recovering a book. That's not true at all. If you are going to read a translation, say, of Mein Kampf versus Mein Kampf being cited in an academic paper, those are two very different things. One of them has inherent contexts and arguments that allow students to engage with it, even if they are offended by it. The other one is a dehumanizing text that assumes that some people are lesser and therefore shuts down the discussion before it even begins.
Sure. So there's a couple things, and honestly, I think that you all just made some really great points. I tried to write down all of them, but if you feel like there was a question or a point you just brought up that I glossed over, please let me know, because I think this is a really important debate, and I'd like to give your responses the full attention they deserve. I think I'll start with this last thing that we talk about, which is how students are forced to self-censor and how, we're putting the burden on people to respond to dehumanizing text. And I do think that there is definitely a cause for concern there if we are taking one student who is dehumanized and saying, advocate for yourself. But that's not the situation we're describing. We're describing a situation in which the entirety of the classroom has access to diverse perspectives, right? The chances that every single student in a classroom, except for one, are going to think that a dehumanizing text is appropriate and agree with it are very, very unlikely, especially seeing as the only examples we have had in this debate of dehumanizing texts are in the context of educators using them as a sort of, this is what you don't do, right? So when we say that counter speech is effective, it's not one student has to defend themselves. It's an entire community of students foster care for each other and make those responses. The other thing is this sort of question I think you pose, I think is a great question, which is why would we leave a book there if it puts people in harm? And the response is a difficult one, but the reality is that is how life is. And I don't mean to be cliche here, but genuinely, I remember the first time that I came across a book in my middle school library that dealt with a really, really serious topic, sexual assault. I had not been educated on this. I had not been educated in the curriculum, and it was something that caused me at the time a lot of distress, a lot of trauma, right? And I, in a lot of ways, wish that was introduced in a curriculum instead, but regardless, I am glad that I read that book when I did, because I read that book, I think, in middle school. And middle school, high school, it's such an important time for, women to have awareness of the gendered violence that exists. And when we talk about books like To Kill a Mockingbird, it is important that we have awareness of what racism looks like. It is very important that we have examples of books that are hard to read, of things like school shootings. These are important conversations, because if the first time that you encounter a topic like a school shooting or sexual or racial violence is in real life without any prior literature on it, you are going to be completely underprepared. We cannot erase these topics. The best thing we can do is start with literature and work our way up so that people are prepared to deal with them. And finally, Langston, go ahead.
Sorry. I would also like to add that banning books is a negative liberty, right? It's taking something away. And even though we could agree that some books should never be taught in curricula, there's also this question of who gets to decide what books will be banned, right? In my example, when I talked about where I grew up, the government decided, and everything that was against the government, banned. So I'm wondering if the affirmative has any qualifications or any criteria that a book would have to meet to qualify to be banned, and such to not have a slippery slope.
I want to begin with the argument about the real world versus school, and then I'll pass it over to Vincent for the second part. So in terms of the real world and school being direct parallels of each other, on the University of Arizona campus, we have these blue lights where if you ever feel like you're in danger on campus, you can run to the blue light and you can push a button to ask for help. Those don't exist in the real world, right? You walk through the other neighborhoods in Tucson and you don't have those. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't be on campus, right? I think that we do need to address these topics. We're not saying that we should shy away from controversial issues. We're asking for them to be taught in a structured way. That's why we put so much emphasis on secondary texts. We believe that sexual assault should be addressed. We believe that racism needs to be questioned. But the way of questioning it isn't having students read texts that are engaging in a bad faith discussion. The way that you have reasoned engagement is you have students read texts in curriculum where they're used as secondary sources for a broader discussion. And we can have that discussion. But I don't think that we should introduce that discussion and throw students into a discussion that is in bad faith.
And to follow up on the second part to your guys' question on what exactly are these texts or like offensive language or messages, that's why we use the Supreme Court decision of Jablinski versus New Hampshire, because that has been used time and time again, especially in terms of like book censorship or just free speech censorship cases, in which they define it as the lewd and obscene, the profane, the libelous, and like insulting words. Right? So like these texts that try to cause violence. And even then we've seen like courts upheld to where you don't have this world that the negative is talking about. In fact, as the Seventh Circuit decided in Zygon versus Warsaw, in which school boards in particular can't just establish curriculums on the basis of their own discretion, whatever ideas go, and they just can't impose a pall of orthodoxy, right? So you still have this discourse happening in the status quo. You just don't have these specific original texts that are being provided.
So I think it's important here to draw a distinction really between the advocacies that both sides are making, because I think that the blue light example is very relevant to this debate, but I think it's a little different than how it was introduced. When we see blue lights on a college campus, what do those suggest? Those suggest that in the event of violence, there is some sort of response to it. Blue lights on campus do not ban sexual assault. Blue lights on campus also do not ban people from engaging in racist or violent sentiments, right? Blue lights acknowledge that violence exists and we will create a response to it. And I remember the first time that I walked onto my school's campus and saw the blue lights, it sort of felt a little upsetting, to be honest, because it felt like this is kicking in the towel and saying, yep, you're going to get attacked. So here's what you do when you get attacked. And I didn't feel like that was an appropriate response. But we can't eliminate violence from society. The best thing that we can do is provide avenues for responding to it. And in the same way that we cannot just eliminate violence, we can't eliminate texts that portray it. The affirmative advocacy is that there are legitimate reasons. The affirmative advocacy in an earlier round would be that there are legitimate reasons. But the affirmative advocacy in this round is that there are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from use in curriculum. A text is not a book, it is not a magazine, it is any section of text. When you are advocating that text that is violent should be banned, you're not getting to advocate that, well, we still print the good parts, but we take out the bad. You are advocating that we remove text that is violent, and that is removing the issue and acting as if it solves it. That is not a solution, which is why it is essential that we maintain these books and we maintain solutions and we maintain context. But really, I think one of the largest questions that this conversation produces is when you talk about removing books, that describe things like school shootings or how to build a bomb, are you eliminating the possibility that a student will take an interest in that and will learn how to, are you, by removing these violent texts, eliminating the fact that people can still find them in other places and cause violence?
So I think you made a few points, and I'll go through them. First, the colloquial definition of texts is not just the words on the page, right? But it is the whole book or the whole text, as one would say. You're not just going to ban the ideas. If the resolution wanted us to ban ideas, it would ask us to ban ideas, but it doesn't. Second, I'd like to extend your analogy here. So our opponents are saying that the analogy is that we need to fend for ourselves in the real world. So why ban sexual assault on campus if it's going to happen in the real world and students should just toughen up and figure out how to fight against it on their own? I think that we do need to have rules for an educational environment. An educational environment is not the same as the real world. And in order to foster a productive educational environment, you need sometimes stricter guardrails than are what's happening. And this is especially true with younger children. Additionally, I don't think that we're going to stop all students from taking an interest in repugnant acts if we ban instructional materials. But the university and the curriculum is undeniably an amplifier for information. And we don't want to be amplifying information that helps people perpetuate repugnant acts. There is no scholarly defense for why we should amplify information on how best to kill people.
Hey, I'm going to pause you there. Negative team, if you would like to respond to that, you may, and then we're going to close out this section of the debate. So, negative team, one last comment on that?
Well, part of, I think, what we're advocating for, well, first of all, you talk about colloquial definitions of texts. Well, I'm not entirely sure if when I say a text, I mean a book or a manifesto or a whole sort of volume of literature in which some hateful speech can be described. When I talk about a text and when I talk about a text with friends, I'm talking about what I think is important within the text. And those are specific subsections, right? When people talk about Plato's Republic, they usually just talk about the allegory of the cave, and they don't talk about the whole other sections about aristocracies. But anyway, sorry, I went badly off track there. But I just don't think that your colloquial definition fits into the overarching theme of this debate.
I guess I can add a smidge to my philosophy major partner's response there. I think the most important thing that comes out of the question they prompt to us, which is schools are amplifying texts. And we agree, schools are able to amplify texts. And it is for that reason we feel that they should amplify counter voices. Schools are uniquely situated to amplify why school shootings are bad, to amplify why racism is something that we should take steps to address, to amplify why sexual assault is not okay, and to teach people how to respond to it and how to be an advocate for good. And we believe that will only happen in a classroom where books are not censored.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that spirited discussion. I appreciate it very much. Appreciated that I didn't have to prompt it at all with questions. So excellent job by both teams. So we'll now move to the final phase of the debate. Closing statements. Each team will have 5 minutes, and again, I will give you a warning after 4 minutes, and we will begin with the proponents.
I want to begin with our opponents' arguments. At the beginning of our opponent's case, they quote Carlos Ched saying that the social environment is very important for a child's development and developing into adulthood. We agree. And we say that dehumanizing texts, along with the other examples we provide and I will go through, are harmful to the social and learning environment that developing children and college students alike need to be educated. On their contention 1, context matters. And in our world, we guarantee context for these texts by forcing teachers to present them within secondary sources. Since we both agree there are certain texts that shouldn't be read verbatim out of context, I don't see how they can disagree that they should be presented within secondary sources. It is the best way to present and is a check on teachers' power in this way and makes sure that the power inequity in the classroom doesn't become a problem. Our opponents say, again, that issues need to be taught with context, but there's no context that justifies disseminating information that helps students kill people more effectively. That is just not justifiable and it is antithetical to any scholarly environment. Our opponents offer empowering students to hold their own mock trial to discuss which text should be banned. But this is exactly what our opponents claim they wouldn't do, which is force students to advocate for their own humanity. Students should debate ideas, not debate whether or not they should be allowed to speak in the first place. It is assumed that students have humanity and students should not be forced to defend it within a classroom. Our opponents say the debate is important, and we agree, but bad faith debate is not what we want to produce. And when one side is not engaging in good faith debate by dehumanizing or by promoting violence inherently within their texts, this requires additional context to have a proper debate. Literature can be very insightful. And we're not saying that we're going to ban all offensive texts, but we do provide certain categories of offensive text that require additional scrutiny. So let's go on to the affirmative side and talk about framing. The burden, per the resolution, is that the affirmative has to show that there are justifiable categories of offensive text that should be banned from the curriculum. And we offer the definition the Supreme Court upholds, which again provides a bright line. It says the lewd, the obscene, the profane, the libelous, and insulting words, those by which their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. So let's go through these categories. First, dehumanizing texts. As Christian Rothbald explains, some texts treat others as targets rather than conversation partners. This is not good faith discourse and stifles students' ability to have discourse. Alison Myra empirically shows this by saying that targeted students who face this psychological harm avoid class and engage in self-censorship. They're not even able to advocate for themselves because they're being censored by the text that they are reading. Students' humanity should be assumed, and the discussion needs to be about ideas, not about whether or not they're allowed to participate. And that's what giving context in secondary text allows. Second is inciting words, something that flew a little under the radar, but I think really provides a strong evidence for why certain texts should not be allowed in the classroom. Again, the impacts are enormous here. Ted Grace and Teresa Damisch explain that the negative impact of stress and the fear from these inciting language hurts the students' academics and it hurts their health. And finally, we have instructional materials on repugnant acts, which our opponents repeatedly admitted have no place in the classroom. Their only defense was that teachers wouldn't present them. Well, if teachers aren't going to present them, why not force them to be presented in a secondary context if they choose to go in that direction, just in case? We don't want the universities to be used as a platform for amplification, especially because of Supreme Court decisions that held that those who disseminate the text can be liable if a crime is committed and the text is seen as a vehicle of that crime. There are very obvious bright lines for texts like this, and they constitute antithetical messages to what should be included in a learning environment. So in conclusion, we have clear definitions for what offensive language means and what types of offensive language we are talking about. Our burden is to show that some of these categories of offensive language should be banned. And we provide the example of dehumanizing texts, inciting texts, and instructional materials on repugnant acts, all of which not only harm discourse, but they also harm the learning environment by not allowing productive discussion from all equally. That's what we want. Productive discussion, forcing teachers to present text in a secondary format is the best way to ensure it. For this reason,
thank you. Appreciate your closing statement. Negative team, you may begin.
Can I just clarify? We've had some different times in the other rounds. Is it 5 minutes?
You have 5 minutes. I will give you a warning at 4.
Awesome.
You may begin.
This event is new to a lot of us. Langston came here from chess club, and I came here from the boring debate team. I'm sure Vincent and Finley have their own fun stories, and all of our judges have their really unique professions. It's awesome that we're gathered here today, but we do have to figure out a way to judge this debate. The simplest way you can do so is by simply asking the question the resolution does. So, let us repeat the resolution. There are certain texts with offensive language or messages that should be banned from being used in a curriculum. This text becomes important because this is the most objective way of evaluating the debate. Both sides can come up and add adjectives and modifiers to make it a little more palatable for their side. But ultimately, the rules of debate are that we are bound to the resolution, whatever form it takes. And with this form of the resolution, Langston and I believe in a strong con-negation ballot. This is because, in order for the affirmative to have met their burden of proof, they have to have proven that explicitly there are certain texts that should be banned from being used in curriculum. The most compelling argument coming out of the pro side of this debate are that there are certain texts that should not be presented in their whole form, but secondary. Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that this would happen, as Langston in his rant about philosophy explains that oftentimes when definitions aren't clear, it means we can't rely on them to be enforced properly. If in this debate, we still have a lack of clarity around what the definition of text is, imagine how difficult it would be to ensure that educators are banning things appropriately and not creating a slippery slope in which anything can be banned in any form, way, or shape. So, it is for the fact that the resolution calls us to clearly ask this question that we will focus solely on the impacts of banning books. Namely, that banning books create a complacency with censorship. Again, as Langston talks about in his personal experience, growing up in a country that exhibited censorship as the norm has created a lot of cognitive dissonance for him. Only if we normalize censorship, there is no cognitive dissonance. Because we never learn that censorship is a problem. We simply believe that it's a solution when texts get too uncomfortable or obscene, as the other side justifies. However, obscenity, violence, and all these forms of aggression exist in society. If we ban them from books, it doesn't change the fact that there are people with violent tendencies who will act on them. The best thing that we can do is amplify counter-speech, and there's a couple ways that we do so. But first, let's focus on the pro side of this debate. They make an argument that dehumanizing texts put free speech on the back burner because one side feels elevated over the other. However, throughout this entire long debate, there has not been a single example of dehumanizing texts being used to dehumanize. In fact, the only examples of dehumanizing texts are when they're being used to show why dehumanization is bad, like To Kill a Mockingbird or Huckleberry Finn, projecting notions of racism and ableism as things to avoid, not to celebrate. But secondly, this notion about students self-censoring themselves is simply untrue. Because again, we talk about classrooms as a whole, advocating for one another, not one student trying to defend that this book hurts them, but the class as a collective deciding that this is a book that should be challenged, having mock trials, having conversations with teachers and parents, conversations that don't happen when we ban a book or only provided in a certain context. But finally, they make a claim about stress and fear, which are very, very valid claims, but they're not unique to today's debate. Stress and fear exist when I find out that I forgot I have homework due tomorrow and I've been preparing for Regents Cup. They exist in all forms on campuses, not just because I've read a book that talks about sexual assault. The best thing that we can do is ensure that our literature is matching our life experiences, preparing students to take life by the horns, preparing students to be able to deal with these difficult issues. And that is why we believe that schools that amplify text are able to do so cautiously and kindly. And when they say that there is repugnant text that should not be read, we agree. which is why nobody in this debate has had a personal experience of the time their teacher tried to teach them to build a bomb, because that doesn't happen. I've read Ted Kaczynski's Unabomber Manifesto and dozens of other school shooting related papers in preparation for debate topics, but they have always been accompanied by diverse voices and diverse literature that has allowed me to come to this debate today, not trying to build a bomb. If we take away texts that are disagreeable, we will never know what we will and will not encounter, or what we will and will not do. Censorship is never the answer. There are ways to deal with this that do not involve banning, and Langston and I stand in negation of anything that erases free speech and expression.
All right, thank you. Students, thank you for your participation today. Excellent job by all of you. You've really appreciate the work you've put into this. You've represented yourselves and your universities very, very well. We're very proud of each of you and the work you do and how you represent all of us in our great state. So thank you. Judges, once again, thank you for your time this afternoon. We really appreciate you spending the time with our students and the feedback and effort you put into this. So thank you. With that, we will post the results of this round shortly. You'll be able to find those results on the website, regentscup2021.azregents.edu, as quickly as possible. So good luck, students, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for judging. Good round, guys. It was really enjoyable.
Thanks for judging.
It was excellent to debate you all. Really excellent.
It was very fun. It's a new experience for me because as Abigail said, I'm from the chess club. I've never done this kind of event before, but it was very fun. And I really
think he should join debate team.
I do not think so.
I think it would be a good idea.
Debate's always fun.
Exactly. He left. Okay, we'll go have the conversation about joining debate team privately, but thanks again. Y'all were excellent.
Have a wonderful day, everyone.